Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. All right, so let's jump right into this tonight, and hopefully you've maybe read a little bit about or read a little bit in Ezekiel, getting into the first chapter or so. And tonight we're just going to kind of get a brief introduction into Ezekiel, get some background history, and we'll get through chapter 1. And then next week we'll do chapters 2 and 3, because 1, 2, and 3 are actually the call of Ezekiel. That's God's calling on his life. And so I wanted to just do the introduction, kind of give you a historical background before we get going. And I promise that this lesson, this series that we're going to do, probably going to take me, I don't know, better part of 6 or 8 months to get through. But I'm promising that it's going to be thought-provoking and mysterious, and sometimes sometimes controversial. And we know that Ezekiel was kind of a strange character, even when we compare him to other contemporary prophets of his day. His bizarre behavior and wild dreams and visions, they've prompted some in modern times, especially more westernized commentators. They want to psychoanalyze him and label him as a sociopath or a psychopath or some other kind of path. I don't know. They reason that he must have been abused as a child, and that explains his visions and dreams and behavior. So no, Dr. Freud, just go back to the bench, and we're not going to go that direction. So I think I'm personally just rejecting all that psychobabble, and in favor of, here's a man that was totally sold out to the will and purpose of God. And so that's what I believe we'll see here, and not to add some like I said, psychobabble to the thing. So anyway, wanted to point out to you what we're talking about on a map. All right, you know me and maps. I like my maps, and on this map we have basically the Babylonian Empire at its height, the height of the Babylonian Empire. That's how big it was at that time. And so you got Jerusalem over here and Babylon way over here, and then a lot of what's going to be happening right about in this area here. And so we'll get another map here shortly. In fact, there it is. These are Jewish settlements, and right in here, these were generally the Jewish settlements from the Assyrian period and also the Babylonian period. You got Babylon here, and you got here, right in here is where Ezekiel was, on the Chabar River, or the Chabar Canal, where they combined these two, the Euphrates, and came over into the Tigris. All right, so Ezekiel was, and there's a picture of it. Okay, that canal that was dug, 3,000 years ago, and so irrigation thing, and so it's interesting that something that was done 3,000 years ago, we're still using it today. So here's a timeline of the time that we're talking about here, and this reign right here of Nebuchadnezzar. That's basically Ezekiel ministered totally within the time frame of Nebuchadnezzar. That was the only king of any consequences that Ezekiel had to deal with, and so that's where he was with that. We see Daniel was he kind of bookended both the front and the back end of Ezekiel with his life. And then Jeremiah was also contemporary with Ezekiel, two different kinds of ministries altogether. And so that kind of gives you a point of reference as to where that all fit in with Ezekiel. Now, any comments or questions on that before we get going? Here's another little summary of the book of Ezekiel and how the chapters play out in terms of what their major theme was. And there's other types of divisions within the book of Ezekiel that we can look at, and we will be as we go on. But Ezekiel's ministry was only about 22 years. He was born around 1622, 1623, into a priestly family. His father was a Kohen named Buzzy or Boozy, and of course I resisted the temptation to say that his mother was named Ruth. Ezekiel's name means God strengthens, and for historical context here, the northern tribes of Israel had been conquered by the Assyrians in 722. That was the fall of Samaria, the fall of Israel, and that was 100 years before Ezekiel's birth. Now, Assyria had declined. They were actually, kind of sort of on the decline, and with Babylon nipping at their heels the whole time. And so we see now that 100 years later, Assyria is no longer a threat, or even it's not even an entity any longer, because Babylon has completely taken it over. And in 605 BC, I'm not going to bore you with all of the there's a whole bunch of other little battles and wars that go on between Babylon and Egypt, and where the Judean king jumps into it. Josiah jumped into that, and then he ended up fighting the Egyptians, got killed, and so forth. And there's that's the history part of it. But what's important to us tonight in our study of Ezekiel is that in 605 BC, Jerusalem was besieged by Nebuchadnezzar, because Jerusalem had kind of rebelled against him and had teamed up with the Egyptians. And so he went down and whipped the Egyptians at Carchemish, and then when he finished off with that, he came up to Jerusalem and besieged Jerusalem and took away I don't know, 10,000 captives or something like that, and carried them off to Babylon. Now, among those captives, of course, were Daniel and his three friends, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and I can never remember their Hebrew names, but they were carried off to Babylon in 605 BC. And in 597 BC, during the second siege of Jerusalem, again, when Judah had rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and here again he came through, and he surrounded the city, besieged it, and hauled off a whole bunch more captives. And Ezekiel was in that group then, and he was sent to the Jewish community there on the Chebar Canal, and so he received his call from God then about 4 or 5 years later in 593 BCE. So he had been over there as a captive or a detainee, it's a little bit different to in how you say that, because they weren't in prison, they weren't in bondage or anything like that. They were just hauled off to that area of the world and not allowed to go back home. So it would be where we captured Germans and brought them over to the States and just kind of let them go, but said, okay, you can't get a visa to go back to Germany, but you're still a prisoner of war. But of course, we didn't do that. We kept them in war camps. But that's what the Babylonians did to the Jewish people, the Israelites, the Judeans, I guess would be more correct, is they captured them, brought them over to Babylon, and then say, okay, here's your Jewish community that's already been established, because the Assyrians had let them have their own little places, and the Jews then settled in established Jewish settlements. They weren't scattered out to where they were assimilated into the community and then lost their identity. And the Babylonians seemed quite content to let the Jews handle their own local, they had their own local authorities. Their community would have its own leaders, mayor and city council and judges and so forth, to handle their own internal affairs, both religious and civil. And the Jews were allowed then to also have their own businesses, and they could travel as long as they traveled within the Babylonian Empire. They really couldn't. They had to get permission if they wanted to go back to Israel, or to Judah and Israel area, but they could travel. And in fact, a lot of the Jewish people became quite successful in business. Some were bankers and so forth. And so then years later, when the exile was ended and they were allowed to go back home to Israel, only about 20%, if that many, ended up going back to Israel, because they had it pretty good there in Babylon. They were on a nice river, and they had built up good finances, and it was good living compared to some of the distance that they had eked out in Israel. And so they were reluctant to give up this new financial that they had enjoyed while they were in Babylon. So the idea of their exile, yeah, they were away from home and they had been picked up and put away over there, but it was not terribly onerous as to what it could have been. They were not put in concentration camps, enslaved like when Israel was in Egypt or something like that. So that's where Ezekiel, he was picked up when he was about 25, 26 years old, and deported to that region of, it's called Kebar, Nippur, I think it's Nippur. The ruins that they dig up there now, that the archaeologists are going through, it's called Tel Aviv or Tel Aviv, but it's in Iraq and not in Israel. So there is a Tel Aviv in Iraq today that is this former settlement of Jewish people back in the Babylonian exile. So Ezekiel is there. He's about 4 to 5 years in there. And so that's where we begin the scriptures for tonight. In the 30th year of the 5th month of the 4th month, in the 30th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, as I was among the exiles by the river Chebar, the heavens opened and I saw visions of God. This vision would have occurred in 593 BCE. Now, the dates that I give, the years that I give, can vary by 1 year this way, another year that way, and in some cases. So it's a little bit difficult to actually pin it down although I saw one guy who had gone through all sorts of machinations to to tell me that it was on the September 23rd of 593 or something like that. But his calculations were so convoluted that I couldn't keep up with him, couldn't follow him at all. He may be right, I just couldn't follow it. But it's 593 BCE, give or take. And so since both he and King Jehoiakim had been captured and carried off in this second deportation, Ezekiel uses he dates his vision from that time. And so when he says in the 30th year, that meant probably that he was talking about in his own life. He was 30 years old now, and if he had stayed in Israel, he would have then been entering the priesthood as a priest in the temple, because that's when priests they started their service was at the age of 30, and then they retired at the age of 50. And so if you might remember that Yeshua did not begin his ministry until he was 30 years old, even though he was not a priest. He was not of the priestly line of Aaron. He was of the line of Judah. Of all of the Old Testament prophets, here there's a reference here to, it says that the heavens opened up to him. Now, this is the only place that I could find where the heavens opened up to a prophet. Now, there were places where that talk about and the heavens opening up, and David talks about the windows of heaven, and Solomon does, and talk about the heaven opens up, and but the idea of heaven opening up for one person to view, it only happened to Ezekiel in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament. Now, we have 3 incidences where it happened in the New Testament, in the Brit Hadashah, that the heavens were opened up and that was to Yeshua when he went down to be immersed with Yochanan, the immerser, John the Baptist. And that was in Matthew 3:16, and then also to Stephen when he was being stoned to death. The Bible talks about and the heaven was opened up, and he could see Yeshua up in heaven. And then, of course, then the last one was with John, the apostle, the revelator, in the book of Revelation, talking about the heavens opening up so that John could see a vision. So those are the only times that I could find that where heaven opened up to people. What we're going to see here is that he's in this chapter, he's giving his vision of God. Okay, that's just the vision. In chapters 2 and 3, for next week when we get into that, that is the actual call. That's where God comes in and says, "Okay, Ezekiel, I have a job for you." And so let's go ahead then in verses 2 and 3. In the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity, the word of Adonai came to Ezekiel the Kohen, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Kebar. The hand of Adonai was upon him there. All right. Now, what we see here is, now here's some pictures that I pulled off the internet. There's quite a few representations of what it was that Ezekiel saw, and these are just part of them. Now, what he's doing here in verses 2 and 3, and it seems like that's a theme common with Ezekiel, is that he repeats things a lot. He'll say something, and then a verse later on, he'll say the same thing over again. And so, he says in the first verse there that in the 13th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, and then again on the 5th day of the month, and he qualifies it just a little bit in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. So he's clarifying it just a little bit, or maybe quantifying it a little bit differently, but it's basically saying the same things, the same day that he's talking about. But there is a difference in what he's talking about here. Now, it noted that verse 1, he talked about, I was among the exiles and the Kebar when the heavens opened, and I saw the visions of God. Well, in 2 and 3 here, he's shifted over to the third person, and generally speaking, this is a little odd. This is a little strange, because generally speaking, throughout the book of Ezekiel, everything that Ezekiel talks about is always in the first person. God said this to me, I said this to him, and that's pretty much the only conversations, because he does not allow dissent or anything that someone else could come in there and dispute his word. He doesn't give him any audience at all. So all he's doing is talking about what God said to him, and what he saw, and what he may have said to God. So that's the only things that you're going to see. He doesn't dwell at all on his own particular personal problems, as did Jeremiah. Jeremiah was very famous for telling you, all of his troubles and woes. Ezekiel, his wife died, and during that time, and God said, no, you don't, no time for mourning, just keep on going. And he never said a thing. He went on with the business of God. And so that's where we are at 2 and 3. Now let's go on, because here's where the vision begins. I looked, and behold, a storm wind came up from the north, a great cloud with flashing fire and brightness all around it, and something like a glowing alloy out of the fire. From within it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. This was their first appearance. They had a likeness of a human, but each one had 4 faces, and each one of them had 4 wings. Now, these living creatures are cherubim. We're just that's the classical definition of a cherubim, and the description of them. And this windstorm, a lot of times windstorms, they will indicate a coming change to something, or where God is getting involved in something, where Elijah went up in a whirlwind, and then other times the Bible talks about a strong wind came through with Elisha, and also I believe with Isaiah. But there were times where these storms were an indicator of change, and that God was in the middle of it somewhere. So that's what while he's out there looking at this approaching storm, and then at that point God gives him a vision coming out of that storm. So was the storm just a natural phenomenon? Maybe so. It doesn't really matter. But he described that he was watching a storm, and from that then God used it. And God uses lots of times he will use natural phenomenon to speak to us if we will just listen. Appearances of the cherubim, they sometimes accompany references to God's glory and holiness in the Old Testament, but their actual specific function still remains a mystery to this day. We know some of the things that they did, but what was their main created purpose? It's kind of mysterious. Ezekiel would have been familiar with the cherubim because they were represented on the ark and in the curtains of the temple. And because remember, those were embroidered on the curtains of the temple. He would have known that, being the son of a priest. And in fact, in preparing for priesthood, when he was captured, he possibly would have been allowed to go into the holy place and see, or at least in the courtyard to see the cherubim embroidered on those outer curtains. And so the Mesopotamians, the people of that region, they also they pictured spirit beings that were guarding their temples and in their artwork. If you'll remember the gates there at Babylon that they've reconstructed, that they had similar type figures, the dragon on the 2 feet or something with the wings and so forth. It was a kind of like cherubim, but not. So that was kind of a common thing. It was not unusual in Middle Eastern theology to see that kind of a being. And here's another rendition of the cherubim. And so, somewhere along the line, somebody had gotten the idea of the cherubim being, or cherubs being the cute little fat naked baby with the bow and arrow that attacks people on Valentine's Day. And that was, a lot of people, when they think about cherubim, that's what they think of. But no, these creatures were large and terrible and probably very, very powerful, and they surrounded the throne of God. It says their legs were straight and the soles of their feet were like the hoof of a calf. They sparkled like the color of burnished bronze. They had human hands under their wings on their 4 sides. The 4 of them had faces and wings, and their wings touched one another. They did not turn when they moved. Each could move in the direction of any of its faces. As for the form of their faces, each had a human face, and the 4 had the face of a lion on the right side. The 4 had a face of an ox on the left side, and the 4 had the face of an eagle. Calf hooves may suggest, a lot of this stuff is, okay, we're describing it now. What does it mean? Well, it's all over the place. There's just a lot of speculation as to what it would mean. It's this, Ezekiel doesn't come in later and say, okay, now what I meant by the calf hooves was this. No, he never goes back and explains that. But they would suggest nimbleness. And I don't know if you've ever been around cattle, and it's just kind of fun to watch calves, especially when they're young calves, and the way that they dart in and around on the pasture. And it's just really a lot of fun as they're cavorting around like that. And so that would kind of suggest that these were nimble creatures. We find out later on, yes, indeed they were. And the human hand part, now that, to me, again, couldn't find any commentator that was going to explain to me what the human hands meant. But to me, the human hands emphasized the humanity of the cherubim juxtaposed to the 4 faces and the wings, because this is a creature that, it may have had a body of a human, sort of, because it had wings and calves hooves. Although the legs were straight, they weren't bent like the calves hooves, backwards. They were bent, they were forward. They're straight legs, and they had these wings and the 4 faces. I mean, certainly not something that you see every day on the street corner of Houston. And so the human hands, then, to me, maybe makes it a little bit less terrifying in some ways, that at least part of these things, because hands are something that we connect with people with our hands. And so that is something, you hold the hand of a child or your spouse as you're walking down, walking in the store or something like that. If you don't do that, if you don't hold your wife's hand when you're going in the store and stuff like that, gentlemen, I suggest you get to it and do that, because life's kind of short. Okay, hold your wife's hand, tell her you love her. I don't know where that came out of. That's not in my notes. Okay, so but the hands are very important. Something that's the feel, the tactile, sensory things there. So that's why I think the hands were important. Now, the faces. What did the faces come up and mean? Now they, in some ways, the faces were more of a generic kind of a picture from Middle Eastern theology and mythology, but it's, man being the ruler of the earth, as it were. And then the bull, well, he was the king, he was the most preeminent of the domesticated animals, and that's the way the Hebrews, the Israelites, looked at these animals. And then you had the lion, who was the kind of the king. He's the one that is represented as the king of the wild animals, as it were. And then the eagle, of course, being the ruler of the air. And so Cynthia was saying, I guess she sent that to everybody, that the four faces of the aspects of Yeshua's deity. The lion is his kingship. The bull represents his priestly calling. The eagle is his prophetic calling. The man is his humanity. That is an aspect. If you're looking at these things to be part of representing Yeshua, that would make sense. And I'm not real sure that I had ever read that before. Probably have, but I didn't think of it. So thank you for that comment. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out above. Each creature had two wings touching the wing of another, while another two were covering their bodies. Now, each being could move in the direction of any of its faces wherever the Ruach would go. They went without turning as they went. As for the form of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of a fire, resembling torches moving between the living creatures. There was brightness to the fire, and lightning went forth from the fire. The living creatures were running back and forth like flashes of lightning. All right, now this gives you kind of a picture, further picture of what these things look like. And to me, and looking at all the different pictures and so forth, where you got the figure that they would move, but they didn't turn, so they just moved. Maybe it would be kind of like a chess piece that always faced forward, and it never went diagonally or anything. It never turned diagonally. It was always going forward or to the side or to the back, but always the one face was facing in any particular direction. And so it kind of gives me an idea, though, too, looking at all this, of kind of like a gyroscope. If you've ever had a gyroscope and it's spinning, and so it'll move in a certain direction, but then when you try to tilt it on an axis or something like that, you meet resistance, so that there's stability in that gyroscope. And so that's kind of what I look at. This is not something that is helter skelter, but there's an element of stability and strength there. I also looked at that, and where they were talking about they were running back and forth like flashes of lightning. Now, what I just think about out here where we live, in the summertime, we are inundated with hummingbirds, and they will just all over the place. And you get to know the sound of them, and of their buzzing with their wings buzzing, as well as then their little chirping. And definitely hummingbirds have a sound and of all their own. And so when I read this part of Ezekiel, and it's talking about them flitting back and forth, but like flashes of lightning. That's kind of like a hummingbird does. They can just zip all over the place. It's almost as if you can't see them go. From the only time that you can see them is when they actually pause for just a second before they flit off again. So that's kind of the image in my mind as to what I see. That now the burning coals, that's similar to what some of the things that Daniel saw in his many visions. But for me, burning coals is I mean, I've stared into a campfire for hours at a time, just watching those coals and the light that they put off and the heat that they put off. And there's something kind of mesmerizing about being able to sit there and watch these coals and how brilliant that light is. And so this is what what Ezekiel is describing here, that's what these figures look like, is that they were basically on fire. They were coals of fire. And I just noticed that these characters were characters of light. They weren't characters of darkness. And so you want to look at these things. These guys are coming from the Lord. Okay, this is because he's light and he's not darkness. And so these creatures that Ezekiel sees here in a manifestation of God, they are they're characterized by light and fire and giving off a radiance. So I thought that was kind of important, that these are light and not darkness. Okay, any comments or questions so far? I know we're kind of buzzing through some of this stuff. So it says, as I looked at the living creatures, behold, one wheel was on the ground next to each of the four-faced creatures. The appearance and structure of the wheels was like the gleaming of beryl. The four had the same likeness. Their appearance and their structure seemed to be a wheel within a wheel. When they went in any of their four directions without pivoting as they went. Their rims were high and awesome. All four rims were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them. When the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Wherever the Ruach wanted to go, they went in the direction the Ruach, the Spirit of God, wanted to go. The wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. Whenever the creatures went, whenever the creatures went, the wheels went. When the creatures stood still, these wheels stood still. When the creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose with them. For the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. All right, so these are some of the things that we look at with Ezekiel, where he's being a little bit redundant. He'll say things a couple of times. Now, here's a representation of possibly what he was looking at. We don't know, because Ezekiel was trying to explain something that's inexplicable. I mean, it just can't be explained as such. Our words, even Hebrew, would not be adequate to really explain what it was that he was looking at. A wheel within a wheel, maybe that's what that is. I'm not sure, but that was just one artist's rendition. But the meaning of the wheels is unclear, because they're just with any of the commentators, most of them will say, yeah, well, we don't really know for sure what it means, but there are some ideas out there. The orientation of the wheels, if they were if they were perpendicular to each other, like that picture indicate, then that would mean that the power of God is not restricted by direction. In other words, they can go in a forward way to the side, they can go up, they can go down. The wheel doesn't care because it's still oriented in a direction that it's going to move. And so these wheels that we're looking at, they're no ordinary wheels, of course not, because they're in a vision and they're locked in the wheel within a wheel. And how do you have a wheel within a wheel with, in terms of what was their axis? Where was their axis? Well, maybe their axis was in the top instead of like a wheel that we're used to, where you have hubs and so forth. But it says that the spirit of the cherubim was actually in the wheels. So these wheels, these inanimate objects, even though they moved around, so maybe they were not totally inanimate, but they said the spirit of the cherubim were in those wheels. So how does that happen? The wheels had the actual spirit of the cherubim. When we know that the cherubim were living creatures, so somehow they were connected in a very, very strong, intimate way with these wheels, so that they acted as one. And so then the eyes, people have speculated that the eyes indicate the omnipresence of God, that he's everywhere, he sees everything, and so that he's the all-seeing God. Nothing is hidden from him. Now, over the heads of the living creatures, there was something like an expanse, shining like the color of ice, stretched forth over their heads. Under the expanse, their wings were stretched out straight, one toward the other. Each one had another pair covering its body. When they moved, I could hear the sound of their wings, like the sound of rushing waters, like the sound of Shaddai, a noise of tumult, like the noise of an army. Whenever they stood still, they let down their wings. There came a voice from above the expanse over their heads. Whenever they stood still, they let down their wings. Here's an artist's rendition of what that may have looked like. It's a little bit unclear in many cases, but it's brilliant live colors and so forth. Again, I don't think there's no way that an artist, well, there's no way a person could really adequately describe what it was that Ezekiel saw. And at the same time, no artist is going to be able to really get out there and portray Ezekiel saw. It's just too wonderful for words, I guess it is what you'd have to say. And so he's just, again, talking about the something that could not be described. He was describing the indescribable. Now, the sparkling ice is dazzling and not particularly uniform. It changes, the colors change. If you've ever been anywhere in the Arctic or the Antarctic with the snow, or a snow out, where everything is so brilliant white, in snow, it's the snow is, of course, white. I mean, it's just brilliant white, and it gets so bright that it's blinding in some cases. But when you've got ice, especially the ice of, say, icebergs, when you look down at an iceberg and you've got all the white up on top, but then you look down from a ship, actually, and you see down there, you can see that blue in the ocean and the blue in the ice. It's a beautiful blue, and that's what I think of when he's talking about the color of ice. In fact, we've got a guy here on our class tonight that was the commanding officer of the International Ice Patrol for several years, Alan Sumi, and so he could tell you all about ice tonight. Talking about ice. He knows a lot more about ice than I do. I just let it go. That I just happened to think about that with Alan. He ran the International Ice Patrol for several years for the U.S. Coast Guard, and basically for the U.S. Coast Guard headed it up for the entire world. So he was Mr. Ice for several years. Okay. And so here, the sound of the cherubim says the sound, it was like an army or rushing waters. If you've ever been to like Niagara Falls, for instance, or Victoria Falls in Africa, or let's see, some of the other, probably the Niagara's probably more where everybody would have ever been around, or someplace where there's a lot of rapids and so forth. It's quite a sound. It can be very noisy, and then it says it's almost like the sound of, it was kind of like the sound of an army. Of course, he would have known about that, because the army coming in and taking them from Israel into or Judah into Babylon. But I'm reminded of the noise that accompanied the appearance of God at Mount Sinai, where he came down from the mountain, and the top of the mountain was burned. But the noise, it said, was like multitude of shofars. When God spoke, it was like someone was blowing gazillions shofarot, that it was so terrible that the people were frightened of the voice of God. And so he's saying that these the cherubim were pretty noisy in themselves. Just those four sounded like an army. And he said it's like the voice of Shaddai. Now Shaddai again is a term, a name for God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It means it has been translated as being the all-powerful God, or the most high God, or most powerful. But Shaddai actually has a root in this word shad here, is a root word that can mean breast, the female breast. So that it was Shaddai is the God who nurtures, the nurturing God, kind of like a mother nurses the child, God who sustains and nurtures his people. And I just thought that's an interesting juxtaposition of there. If you would have to be using it in the terms, in the context of an all-powerful God, when he's talking about the noise of an army, as opposed to the nursing God, who certainly would not be noisy like an army. And then again, he stated this idea of they let down their wings, and he stated it twice. And why does he do that? I don't know. It's just it was his literary style, and you'll see it all throughout writings. So finally, the final verses here. Above the expanse over their heads was something like a throne resembling a sapphire stone. Above the shape of the throne was a figure of human appearance. From what appeared as his waist upward, I saw glowing metal, looking like a fire encased in a frame. From what was like his waist down, I saw the appearance of fire radiating around him, like the appearance of the rainbow in the cloud on a rainy day. So was the appearance of the radiance. It was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of Adonai. I saw it, fell on my face, and heard the voice of the one who was speaking. Okay, so this is toward the end now. He's seeing this is the toward the end of his vision, and we're getting down to the teaser for what comes next week, because now he heard the voice of one who was speaking, of the one who was speaking, and so we'll have to wait until next week to find out what it was the one was speaking to. So, but I wanted to leave you with this. Here's what a sapphire looks like. Okay, if you've ever seen a sapphire. And of course, a sapphire is a color of royalty. And you'll see this beautiful young lady there wearing that ring, whoever she is. And the vision of God showed three attributes of God that I think the first, and I think we kind of summarize it here in the verse 28. The first vision was the reaffirmation of the nature of God. It was holy, powerful, and majestic. This is a big, big God. And second, the rainbow was a reminder of God's promise making, his promise keeping character, where he would remember his promise to his people. When the Israelites were in Egypt, he says, and he remembered the promise. He brought them out because he remembered the promise, and he was going to keep that promise that he had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so third, it was an assurance that nothing, including geographic location over there in Babylon, could separate a person from the love of God. So that and that's all also written in Romans 8 38 and 39, so that nothing can separate us from the love of God. So anyway, that ends the session for tonight. And next week, we'll jump into the rest of it, actually chapters 2 and 3, which is the call of Ezekiel, where God is telling him, okay, this is what I want you to do, and this is what you are to do, and how you're to do it. And here are some rules for when you're talking to the people and so forth. So I think it'll be very interesting when we get into that. So any